Hello, listeners! We are absolutely chuffed you've decided to join us. Grab a packet of biscuits, brew a warm cuppa, and curl up for a wholesome American conversation about quintessential British food from everyone's favourite baking competition. Please enjoy! Hats Off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast.
Welcome to Hats Off to Bake Off, an amateur baking podcast. My name is Malory. I'm here with my friend Nick, and today we are going to talk through our favorite bits of the signature, technical, and showstopper in episode 5 of Collection 1, Series 5, got it this time, of Great British Bake Off, or as we know it here in the US, the Great British Baking Show. And we're also today, something I'm very excited about and have been waiting for pretty much since we started this podcast, we're going to dive into the history of pies. Thank you, Nick. And we're also going to talk about the versions of the bakes that Nick and I tried to recreate this week in our homes. So, Pies and Tarts week. Nick, there's a lot going on. I love it. I think I said in our introductions episode, I'm obsessed with baking pies. So I've been looking forward to this episode for a long time. And I feel like this was sort of your first attempts at some pie crust. I want to get your impressions on this week.
So on the range of pies versus cakes, I feel like you are clearly on the side of pies, and I am clearly on the side of cake. Do you think that's true?
I would rather bake pie but eat cake.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
My mom is kind of known in the family as being the person who makes the apple pie at every important holiday, but she always uses store-bought pie crust. So I've never actually made my own pie crust. And her pies are always perfect. They're always amazing. She's a genius. I don't know how. But that's the closest I ever got to making pies was that. And so I know you make pies all the time, but I just never have. And so this was a nice little delve into something I've never done before, which was making my own pies. And it turned out pretty well.
Yay.
I thought it was successful.
I think I will say that rewatching this episode after having made my own custard tart and just knowing and watching your process made me realize how impressed I was with all of these bakers all over again, because I feel like when you're watching and you have some sort of basic knowledge of baking, it's pretty easy to say like, oh, I could do that. But once you try and actually recreate the challenges, I think that's something that I'm learning a lot from this podcast that I wasn't expecting, is that what they're doing is actually really, really hard. And just seeing how beautiful all of their pies turn out. I bake pies all the time. They're always tasty. They're almost never pretty.
I'm going to post your pie really soon, but it looks beautiful.
I tried so hard.
They make it look like they're just like using Play-Doh, and they make it look so easy. And
I have no idea.
I tried and failed and struggled so hard this week.
I'm so excited to talk about the challenges you tackled, though. We'll get there in a second. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the signature, which was a family-sized custard tart. And that was pretty interesting to watch for me. Tart crust is actually a little bit different than pie crust, and it's a little bit untraditional in that you're baking the custard in the actual crust itself. So you have to blind bake the crust, make sure that that's nice and like dry and ready for you to pour actual liquid into it to then be baked and set. It was just sort of a fun combination of something that like seems like a really classic bake, but watching them do it was, again, I was just like really impressed by the technique that all of them showed and by the flavor combinations that they all came up with. I thought they were amazing.
I mean, you say classic bake. There is nothing more British than custard, I feel. Custard is so quintessentially British. I've had custard. I've never made custard. I will have to make custard at some point, but custard is so British, and so a custard tart just makes sense.
Yeah. This was the challenge that I chose to tackle this week, and I have to admit, I cheated a little bit, and it's just because I found a recipe that I really wanted to use. I thought it looked so delicious. It was a grapefruit tart with chamomile whipped cream that I grabbed off of the blog Lark and Linen. I think I just saw a picture for it on Pinterest, saved it, and then finally saw the opportunity to use it. But she chills the custard overnight instead of baking it, and so I did that version, understanding that I had 24 48 hours to let a pie sit in the fridge instead of 2.5 hours in the tent.
I mean, we say it every week. We are never going to do these in time.
Absolutely not.
Sometimes I'm looking through the math of what these bakes are, and so I did one of the technicals this week, and looking at the math of how it works out time-wise, you're like, how do they possibly do this in the time and make it look so good? I took like hours and it still looks like crap.
This is something I've always wondered. I need to know, and maybe we could look this up, or somebody out there has to know. I've always wondered if Paul specifically, but maybe also Mary, like if they bake it and then go, okay, slash an hour from the time that it took them or something like that. Like, because it seems
I know
unreal.
because I've looked this up. You're Anne Reardon, who I think I talked about last week, actually.
Mm-hmm.
She did a video where she tried, as a professional chef, to do the bakes that Nailed It does. And they're just definitely not given enough time to possibly do anything close to what they're supposed to make.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's
Hollywood
a lot
magic.
closer. I think it just needs to be done perfectly the first time. And that's why the timing is so intense.
Right.
But of course, they're shooting for like 14-hour days. So
yeah,
they can't be like, you have 7 hours to do this. It just wouldn't work out.
absolutely not.
What were your favorites this week? Did you get any inspiration from some of the bakers this week at all?
I did a little bit. Nancy's, first of all, this was one of the bakes that I actually still think about to this day from the first time that I started watching Great British Baking Show, which was Nancy's chocolate and passion fruit tart. It looked so beautiful. It sounded like it tastes amazing. That's on my list to try if I can ever find a recipe anywhere. I haven't looked yet, but I'm sure it's out there and it looks amazing. And then Chetna's Kheer and mango tart looked awesome. And then Louis' tropical Manchester tart, I think, were my favorites.
Oh, yeah. Those were all beautiful and perfect. I grew up on tapioca, which is a little different than Kheer, obviously, but it sounded very similar. It's a custard filled with rice, like a rice pudding. And I was like, that sounds amazing.
Yep.
I wanted that to succeed. But oh, Martha, no. It was so upsetting to watch her because she was just so passionate about it. She was doing so well up until this week. She had a bit of an L on the first challenge.
She knew it was coming though. Like you could see, she was like, pies and tarts, pastry is not my thing. So I think all things considered, I was still proud of her for sure.
I connect to that.
Yes.
So Mary made this comment that it needed a glaze. I thought that tart looked perfect.
Agree.
That tart was beautiful.
Like a glaze would have been nice, but it's not something I would have remarked upon. But again, I think if you're going for like a look in a classic patisserie window or something like that, I can understand why she would have asked for that.
It's a patisserie thing that if it were in a patisserie window, you'd want a glaze. But I thought that a family custard tart,
There you go.
totally fine.
Yeah. I actually used Mary's recipe for the crust from the masterclass episode.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it actually turned out amazing. And fun fact, if you mess up blind baking it, which I did the first time around, I rolled it out too thin. It tastes like sugar cookies. So if you mess it up, it's still delicious.
That's the kind of thing I always struggled with, is that I don't like pies and tarts all that much. Like occasionally maybe, but I'm not really a pie person.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because I like the insides. I'll eat the inside of an apple pie literally any time, but the crust itself has never been my thing. I'm not a big fan.
I'm the opposite.
Really?
I have never liked the insides of pies, but I've always liked the crust.
We're a perfect match,
I love
Mallory.
this. This is my new favorite fact.
Anyway, I did not make a custard tart, though I need to eventually make a custard tart.
You tackled the hardest technical, I think, probably, of them all, which was the mini pear pies, aka the Pie Mummies.
Before I get to that, I was trying to think of something I would make for a custard pie.
Yeah.
If I were going to make a custard tart, they use a lot of fruit in theirs, and as I've said before, I'm not big of a fruit person. Though I found some really interesting variations. There was an apple crumble custard tart, which used like the oats of an apple crumble in the tart pastry, and then had like cinnamon apples. If I wanted to go literally just for like presentation and flavor combos, there was a cherry and sliced almond tart that I found out there that looked really beautiful. But one thing I really wanted to try was like a swirl, kind of like not quite Kate's style of swirl, but like feathering almost. If you could do a feathering in a custard tart, that would be really cool to see. And so I was thinking, what if I do like a classic vanilla or a caramel with like a brownie or dark chocolate custard? So almost the opposite of what Nancy did. I would do a dark chocolate custard, which I didn't think we saw it in this range of custards, but with like a basic vanilla crust. And so I think that would look beautiful. You could definitely do something really interesting with the swirling flavors. I didn't quite find a recipe for it, so I'll have to do some more research, but I think a dark chocolate and vanilla chocolate like swirl would be really cool.
Agree.
And then moving on, you think I did the hardest technical?
I don't know.
Really?
I just watching everybody struggle to cover their pears in pastry, knowing how little time they had. I was just like, can you tell I'm excited? I asked you, I like totally jumped the gun on this, but I'm very excited. I have a million questions. How cool did the pears have to be before you were ready to wrap them? How thin did you make your pastry? Did you have to did your poaching liquid actually turn into a syrup that you could use to like stick the pastry on? I think they just didn't show us a lot of the actual process for this technical. So I was left with a lot of questions. And since you did it, I need you to answer all of them for me, please, and thank you.
So this was actually really fascinating technical to try. I love pears. It's one of the very few fruits that I do like and that I can eat usually. And so I made the poached pears, the mini pear pies that you would wrap like a mummy with their pastry. And it was difficult. It was rough, but it wasn't impossible. I made my pastry from scratch, obviously, and it was one of those things where I'm supposed to grate all of the lard and the butter into the flour, and that went because I don't really have great graters right now. But you're folding it and you're turning it and you're returning it back and forth to the fridge, which already that process is taking like an hour or so. Just getting it cold enough to roll out. And then you're taking wine and cinnamon and orange zest and you're reducing it down until it's actually it's fairly thin when you get to that point where you're going to be coating the pears. But poaching them in that syrup is so strange because you want to keep the stems intact so you can like hold on to them and you can see the pear. You want to see the stem at the top. But I think my problem with it was I needed really firm pears so they wouldn't get too soft. And I needed tall, large pears, and I didn't have that. So obviously with quarantine going on, I had like 3 different kinds of pears.
And you made it work.
I think it would have been far better off if I had used brown pears and Bartlett, I think. I don't know. The generic brown pears would have been fine, but I had to use like a combination of random pears, and they fell apart. Some of them are supposed to scoop out the seeds, and some of them don't really have seeds. So like I'm scooping, and then all of a sudden half my pear is gone. It was a whole thing.
Wait, so they removed the seeds?
So you poach them, you let them cool, and you're supposed to take a melon baller or a teaspoon and scoop out the inside so that you're not like biting through seeds.
Did we see the bakers doing that?
They never show it.
Okay, thank you. This was one of my questions.
It's in the recipe.
Wow.
We never saw that on TV, so I'm very confused by that bit. And so I didn't have a melon baller, so I used a teaspoon, and that didn't work super well because it's not perfectly round. Deep breath. But anyway, once they're cooled, once you have that syrup reduced down to a thin syrup, you just basically brush the pears and wrap the pastry around, just like you said. And that part is shockingly not that hard. You have to roll the pastry out really, really thin, and you make these super long strips. But once you start wrapping it around, it just kind of goes around, and it does actually stick to the syrup. So I didn't have a problem making them. They did not look perfect in the slightest. My strips were all over the place. I didn't have like a pizza cutter, so I couldn't cut them perfectly. Whatever. But they looked really beautiful. They came out golden crispy. They turned out a lot better than I expected. And I have a whole bunch of that poaching syrup that I'm just like, this tastes delicious. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I want to keep it. So
yeah, might as well.
It's using everything you get. So you get this syrup. You're not going to waste it. You're going to find something to do with it. I have a like pear simple syrup now that smells amazing. We'll see what I do with it.
Maybe part of the reason I thought this challenge was so hard from the outside is that the 2 bakers who struggled most with it were Richard and Louie, who we're used to seeing on the top of the bunch, but got, I think, last and second to last place on this technical. And so I think that was the moment that I realized, must have been kind of tricky. And those 2 sort of are known for like their technical prowess, I guess, for lack of a better term. So that was interesting and kind of fun to see them for once not being the best at everything.
Definitely one of the things that they really slipped up on was not trusting themselves of how long something should bake.
Yeah.
The recipe says 25 to 30 minutes, which they wouldn't have known. But when they're going like, oh, it's going to bake for 10 minutes, you're like, no. That's not how this works. So I'm shocked that they even had something that was edible with how little they were baking their things. But for my first attempt at pastry, it went shockingly well.
Yay. Congratulations, Nick.
I can say I've also made a chicken pot pie in the last week because I was like, I'm already making pastry. Might as well try some other things out. And that was an absolute disaster.
Oh, no.
It tasted beautiful. But like you watch them as they like gently roll their pies and it was falling apart and like try to smooth it out and all of a sudden you have a hole in it.
We are going to need to do like a video call next time you try pastry so I can coach you through the process.
I think next time we're doing pastry is patisserie week, so you'll definitely need to help me with that one.
I would be happy to. I find pastry so relaxing, which I know is the opposite of how most people feel about it.
I mean, it feels beautiful and it feels so nice to be doing it, but gosh. Oh no, the next time we're doing pastry is quote unquote pastry week when we do savory parcels and eclairs and whatnot. So
Is that the same? Okay, this is another question. I feel like I think of pastry might be a bigger word when I think of like pie, crust, tart crust, like when I think of combining big bits of fat in a dough that you then roll out thinly and put some other things in. I'm not I clearly don't have the technical language I need to describe this well, but is that the same as like a shoe?
we're about to get into this, Malory, so I'll save it for a second, but
Okay, actually, yeah, that's a great point.
we have flown into this because we have a lot to get through for the second half of this episode. It is time for tea. Do you have tea this week, Malory?
I do have tea this week. I'm drinking leftover chamomile tea from the chamomile whipped cream that I made for my tart.
I'm drinking Diet Vanilla Cola because I didn't feel like making tea this time.
Yep, out of a teacup. Amazing.
I gotta at least pretend to be classy. So, new this week, I've had this idea over the past week, and I really like this idea. I think Malory agrees. Time for Tea is going to be a great place where we can start saying, hey, our listeners started making baked goods, and I really want to talk about them. So, not a lot of you have made a lot because it's a rough time right now, but everything's crazy. But some of you have, and some of you have taken this time where you're at home with your families, you're not working a whole lot, or you're working from home, and you're taking that extra time to make things for your loved ones. And so we already have some friends who have made Swiss rolls from our first episode, and they look so good. I'm so impressed that they have gone out and tried these things. I know one of our friends made like a chocolate roll with, what did he use? He like half cheated and used pre-made frosting, but other half was a ganache that they made. And so
It was so good.
One of our friends' mom listened to the show and made a Swiss roll for the first time, and they had a bit of a learning curve.
It turned out great,
It turned out amazing. So I'm super impressed by all your guys' bakes. I want to see them. So please, if you make them, let us know. Send us a message on Instagram or on Twitter.
We'd be happy to give you a shout out.
Use the hashtag HotBowPod. We would love to talk about your bakes. Moving on. Malory, I warned you about the history section this week. Do you remember what I told you?
I remember it being a little daunting, but instead of me feeling daunted, which I probably should have, I instead felt more excited and ready to listen. So that's all I've got.
Listeners, we've made this joke personally, I think. I'm not sure if I've ever said it out loud. The Hot Bow Pod drinking game is just whenever we say we're excited about something, you should take a drink. And I'm going to say it like 9 times in the next 20 minutes, so prepare yourselves. Please don't play this game. It's not recommended. I told you, be careful. In the history of pies and tarts, we will talk about placenta, dwarves, and magpies.
Oh, that's right. You sent me that in a text, and I read it, and I went, what? And then got just, even more ecstatic to listen. And so I can't wait any longer. You have to tell me everything you know about pies.
The more I learned about the history of pies, the more my mind was blown at every turn.
Yes.
There's so many weird little history bits in here. I'm going to say it. I'm super excited to teach you about pies.
Yay. I'm super excited to listen and learn.
That is at least 3 or 4 drinks if you're counting. Drink responsibly, friends. So to begin, about how far back do you think we're starting?
What did we say? We said that ancient Egyptians and Romans were using eggs in their bread. So I would assume similar time frame.
The farthest back I could find in my history report was about the ancient Egyptians. So 6,000 BC,
Okay.
about 8,000 years ago, we were making a distant relative of the pie. You remember when we talked about bread week, we talked about the dura cake or the bucellum. Egyptians around this time probably made the first galette.
Oh yeah, I still love a good galette.
I think you have a very pretty picture of a galette that we should post sometime soon.
I'll do it.
But Egyptians are making a galette out of basically a paste of water and flour. They may have been the first people to investigate desserts. There's proof of the Egyptians' love of desserts on the tomb walls of Pharaoh Ramesses II. I think I said that right. And they would either incorporate honey and nuts and fruit into their breads, or I found a galette version where they would use this flour and water paste and layer it with honey, and they'd bake that. And that was basically just a very generic freeform disc of sweet bread,
Yum.
very much like a pie. That's the beginning of pies. However, pastry comes along with the Greeks. So Greece might have been the first civilization to make pastry. They didn't have butter or lard or vegetable shortening. They had olive oil, so they probably made their pastry with olive oil.
What?
And there's a saying out there that for a while, everything was pie. Why? Well, if you're cooking meats, you're cooking them either right over the coals or over the fire, and all that fat and the juice and the moisture is dripping away and just leaving you with a tasteless hunk of meat. However, if you wrap the meat in wet leaves or in a pastry made of flour and water, then you're saving the juices and cooking your meat so that it tastes a lot better.
Wow.
So for thousands of years, that's what pastry did, was it encased pretty much anything we wanted to eat, and it made our food just taste better.
Just a bunch of ancient beef Wellingtons.
Pretty much. The Romans also did this, so they would take this from the ancient Greeks, and then obviously their culture went around Europe and all over the world basically, and they shared their love of pastry. The Romans actually, they would eat meat in their desserts, not just in their dinners.
I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that.
Okay, you ready for your first mind-blown moment here?
Okay, yes.
There is a great quote I found from what'scookingamerica.com. They said, according to historical records, meats and fish were common in Roman puddings. It is thought that the puddings were a lot like pies.
Okay, I can get behind that if it's like a savory pie, but if you're doing a sweet pudding.
But do you remember our puddings week? I said that.
Yeah, it was like steamed. Yeah, that started off as sausages because they were steamed, and then it became anything.
They were cooked in a mold, and they used to have meat in them, and then throughout the years, they became more and more sweet. So their desserts, or their second table or whatever, was, probably meats, but also mixed with fruits and honey and cheese. So
okay.
I don't know if it'd be necessarily the dessert we have today, because they didn't have access to sugar, at least not on the scale that we have.
Yeah.
But their desserts, quote unquote, started with meat, and they were basically like pies.
I feel like a trend I'm starting to notice in these history bits is that most of these dishes started out as easy ways to prepare a meal and then morphed into desserts and sweeter, more like celebratory items than like your meal.
So as we'll see as I move forward in the history, for a long time, this was a lot like hardtack. The pie crust or the pastry was entirely used to preserve food or to make it taste just better, to be cooked inside, not to be eaten.
Okay.
But one example, though, of a pastry you would have eaten in those days, Cato the Elder from Rome recorded a recipe for placenta, or placenta cake, as you might see it.
Absolutely not.
We're getting to the first of the three. So this placenta cake, or placenta pastry, was layers of small discs of pastry with honey and cheese flavored with bay leaves.
That part sounds great.
Now here's the fun part. Next second mind-blown moment. What came first, the organ or the pastry?
I don't know.
Shockingly, it was the pastry.
Okay.
The organ was named after the pastry, which was a small round disc of layers of pastry.
Okay, so there wasn't any... Wait, please clarify. There was no placenta being used in the placenta pastry.
No. God,
They just
no.
named
I mean, I hope
a
not, but I don't
placenta
think so.
after the pastry.
I mean, obviously, this is a bit of like, it's placenta in English, obviously. I don't know if it's still placenta in other languages. But
that's sort of
the
left
idea
over.
of the placenta, it eventually became what we call placenta now because of its similar shape.
Okay, that's infinitely more cool and infinitely less gross than my initial assumption about where you were headed with the combination of placenta and pies.
I mean, this
Phew.
sounds like a fascinating recipe because it was like you'd layer cheese and honey and bay leaves together over and over until it made like a little round cake. But honestly, that was so exciting to learn that I was like, what? I never expected to ever learn more about the placenta ever,
I feel like baking,
especially not in Hot Bo Pod.
it's so true. Baking can seem so tame, and then you realize that it's really the story about how people eat, and people eat all different ways. And I think it always says a lot about cultures. And so you always get to go down these really cool cultural roller coasters about what was happening at that time and what that said about what the type of food that they were eating. Like, it's always so interesting.
People
to me.
did a lot of weird things before they got to what we got to today.
It's so true. And I'm such a nerd about it.
It makes me wonder what will be the weird new food we're eating in like 1,000 years.
Yeah,
They'll look back on us and be like, how
Hopopod
are
of
they
then
ever
is
do
like,
it?
oh my God, can you believe?
But let's bring it back closer to England. So this is the Great British Baking Show, Great British Bake Off. Let's bring it to medieval Europe. So there's a lot of history here. I could go on for hours. I'm not going to. But first thing you should know is that the Roman Empire expanded into Europe and pie went with them. So it was around this time that the pie crust was still a vessel and less of a delicacy. So in this era, pies were made for the upper class and eventually would become part of the lower class culture. And this time, pies were often referred to as coffins, or they weren't really called pies, they were called coffins.
Interesting.
So COFYNS. And so coffins were made with unbelievably thick pastry. So this is what I was talking about earlier, is that these pies were filled with meats, but the pastry wasn't a part of it. Pastry was only really ever made by like the upper classes chefs, and you would crack into these coffins. So coffin meaning box or casket.
Mm-hmm.
You would crack into the pastry, pull that apart, and eat the inside out. You wouldn't eat the pastry part of the pie.
Gotcha. That's a very sort of rich person thing, to cover your one food in another food and then completely discard the outside food.
Yeah. And so the upper classes were supposed to feed the poor and feed their servants. There's no good proof that this ever happened, but it's likely thought by food historians that this pie case, it's still flour and water, coated in gravies and whatnot. It may have been fed to their servant boys. It may have been fed to the poor on the streets, but it was never meant for the upper class, the kings and the queens and the princes and the princesses and the whatnot. So we don't really know.
Okay.
However, pies in this time were filled with a lot more than just your ordinary 21st century mates. They were filled with literally anything. Anything you could encase in pastry went into a pie. Whether that was wild duck, mutton, beef, lamb, any kind of crow or peacock, anything went into a pie. And if any of you are a little squeamish about animal cruelty, please forward a minute and a half or so, because this part is a bit rough. Animated pies were all the rage in the high courts of around this time.
Animated?
Animated pies. There was even a song about this. So there's a common nursery rhyme called Sing a Song of Sixpence. One of the very first lines goes, 24 blackbirds baked into a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing.
Oh my God.
And so this is a real thing where they would bake a pie with live birds inside.
No.
That would either fly out or start singing when you open up the crust.
So they couldn't, so the goal wasn't to bake the bird. You wanted to bake the pie, but with the bird still alive to then...
Yep.
Were the other foods in there, or was this just a weird bird trick?
Well, it gets even weirder. So animated pies could be anything. There was one example I found of a giant pie that when it cut open, there was a 22-piece orchestra inside. I don't know. It was very strange. People would pop out, animals would pop out, all kinds of wild things. And so that brings me to the next part of our trio, a man named Geoffrey Hudson. He was a famous 17th century man with dwarfism. When he was 7 years old, he was only 18 inches tall and one of the shortest men that Europe had ever seen. In the court of England's King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria, they were served a pie that before she could cut into the pie, a small man dressed in armor popped out of the pie and presented himself to the queen. So, this was Geoffrey Hudson as a young boy, and later he went on to become the court dwarf, was named Lord Minimus, and served with the queen for basically the rest of his life. If you're interested in this guy, he's wild, and I recommend looking him up because he was like sold into slavery, then kidnapped by pirates twice,
What?
and then returned to Europe. He has a portrait of him and the queen together.
Wow.
The reason he's famous is because he popped out of a pie.
Okay, my new theory is that they must have baked the crust supported separately and like put it just like dink on top of whatever was there. I don't know. I'm going to have to do some more research into this. I'm appalled.
But for the last of our trio, I said we talked about magpies. And this is actually one of the most interesting parts of this. So this is about why is a pie called a pie? Well, as I just said, it used to be called a coffin and wasn't called a pie. That was a fully enclosed, four-walled pie, was called a coffin. You had such things as open pies, but they were called tarts, or specifically were known as tarts, or sometimes traps. However, you did have a small black and white bird, similar to the crow, that was referred to as a pie, P-Y-E. We know them now as magpies, but mag came later. I found this great article by NPR, an article titled For the Origin of Pie, Look to the Humble Magpie by Alison Richards. I recommend giving it a read. It's really fascinating. The Latin for the magpie that we know today is pica, and the magpies themselves are known as pies. And so one theory is that the food looked similar to the black and white plumage of a pie. So whether it be the dark and the light meat inside or the pastry versus the meat inside, pie became slang for things that were patterned or had several colors.
Okay.
So this was another one of my like aha moments, my little mind explosion. The Pied Piper.
Oh.
Why is he called the Pied Piper?
He was probably like dressed in stripes.
He was dressed in multiple colors or in two different colors.
What?
And so the Pied Piper is known that because of his dress. Piebald horses are splotchy black and white horses.
Oh my gosh.
Pied wagtails, another bird, also are double colored. And so this idea that the pie would look like this bird is possibly a reason that we started calling them pies.
These must have been prolific birds then for their name to be then built into part of the cultural slang.
There's another theory that's very similar, but you're absolutely right. Either version of what it eventually became it came from the magpie. And so probably to distinguish between pies and magpies, we start calling them something different. But they popped up in manuscripts from the 13th century even. So they were very well-known little birds. More likely, the possibility that we started calling these foodstuffs pies was the magpie's tendency to gather various odds and ends to make their nest. And so that related to what was in a pie at the time was literally anything. Any odds and ends would go into a pie, be baked and served, and that's more likely the reason that we start calling them pies, is it was very similar to their idea of making a nest by grabbing odds and ends from around town.
I love that.
Similarly, again, so cool.
Galaxy brain.
Haggis. Haggis may refer to the old French word haggis, meaning, can you guess?
No, I know nothing about French.
It meant magpie.
Oh, well, okay, that's on brand. I see now. Okay.
Same idea, haggis. If I didn't get a chance to explain this in Pudding Week, but haggis is made from like odds and ends of
odds and
offal.
ends. Yeah, offal.
That's stuffed into the stomach. And so same idea, haggis is odds and ends put into a mold to make a sausage or whatever you want to classify haggis as. But it's the same idea that it was named after the magpie.
Wow. So then at what point did these pies go from being, and their pastry casings go from being a vehicle to an actual delicacy and more like buttery or more of a flaky, actual desirable thing to eat?
So it probably came a lot later when we started to use butter more. We started to have access to sugar. And that's where I'm going to next, is basically pies were iconic in England, but pies were specifically meat. In England, if you had fruit in a pie, it was probably a tart. And these were very popular at that time, but they probably didn't have a whole lot of sugar in them. And so when we went to America, somehow it got changed in our American vocabulary, very similar to the biscuit week when we said that like biscuits became their own thing, so did pies. We reserved meat pies for terms like pot pie,
Mm-hmm.
whereas pies in America became what they had once referred to as tarts. So fruit pies became
Tarts.
the tarts, or tarts became fruit
Yep.
pies. And so it was around this time that eventually we started expanding and colonizing. We had sugar plantations, and sugar started growing widely in Southern America. And it was then that fruit pie became a very American, nothing as American as apple pie, that kind of idea. Grew out of that turn of the
Sort of the economics of
that
the
era.
slavery built around the sugar
And so really that's
plantations.
when like home baking became a thing too, was that like sugar all of a sudden became a thing. And people got super excited and they started making pies with whatever they could find. The expansion into the West, the orchards in the North, they used all of these things came together to become a fruit sweet pie that we know today in America.
Wow.
I think that's good for now. There's so much more I could talk
I
about.
love that you gave me extra reading to do, which I'm going to do literally as soon as we stop talking. But I love that you were able to summarize what you needed to and then also say, but here are things that you should also check out if you are still interested, which is great. And I'm very excited to read those.
One extra fun fact that I think is also a little strange. Remember I said a pica is the Latin word for magpie?
Mhm.
Pica now is the word for weird cravings, usually inedible items like dirt, but
Huh.
also it's very common in pregnant women where they crave weird odds and ends like the magpie.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Language is crazy, y'all.
Language is wild, but I think that's enough about the history of pies. There is so much more you can go into if you want to look it up. There's, I think, even a website called everythingpies.com. Like, people are wild about pies. People in America love their pies. And so they're a little different in England, but I think we can share that love of pies.
Agree. And so that really brings us so wonderfully into the 3-tiered pie challenge that was the showstopper, which is pretty much end all be all of meat pies. It seems like there was very clearly a trend in the tent to do meat pies with some fruit and sweeter pies happening, but most of it was very savory and meat. And then we really did also get to see a lot of variance in the types of crusts that were used. I myself have never baked with hot water crust and really want to, and I'm very intrigued by it. But I thought it was really interesting to see the ways that the bakers themed the pies. And now actually knowing a lot more about this history, it makes sense. And I think a lot of the fillings that they chose would have been classic for them, but were things that I had never thought of before.
Remember how I said that we had a lot of pies that were a mix of fruit and meat together? I think, was it Louis who did that?
Yeah, Louis
Yes, he did the
topped
four
all of
fruity
his.
seasons.
Yep.
Which I think that comes from a very classic tradition of putting fruits and meats together in a pie.
Yep.
Mincemeat, I think, if I'm not mistaken, mincemeat used to be a mix of fruit and meat, and then slowly through the years it became cheaper to just be fruit and sugar. So I think that's a tradition that we don't understand quite as well in America, but was very proper British.
Yeah. I think my favorites probably of the bakes that were shown were Kate's pork pies. First of all, I loved the theming around that. And then Chetna's decorated fusion pies, even though they didn't really spend too long on hers, they looked amazing. And then Martha's as well went, I thought, really well, given how nervous she was. Her 3 little pigs, that was amazing. And the flavors were great. And it seemed like Paul really enjoyed it. So that was amazing.
And we can't talk about this challenge without talking about Nancy's hand-raised pies.
Yes, so
that
true.
She made 3 different pies that sat together and looked beautiful, and she never used a tin.
I know. She's
a next level baker.
She's the one who pretty much always inspires me to just take it to the next step. And she inspires me to be a better baker constantly.
If you were to do this challenge, what would you do? Neither of us did this. There was no way we're making 3-tiered pies.
Absolutely
3-tiered
no.
pies in quarantine.
I don't think I would have enough flour to make it through the
But
challenge.
it looks like you have some fascinating ideas.
Yeah, so I was trying to think because I know that one of the requests for this showstopper was, okay, you're making 3 separate pies that you're going to stack on top of one another, but they should have a theme that draws them all together. And I was trying to think of a theme that sort of expressed who I was as a baker, but then also I thought would be delicious. And one of my favorite pies that I grew up eating actually is mushroom pie. So I was raised vegetarian, and my mom at Thanksgiving would always bring and make a mushroom pie as sort of our vegetarian entree for the family Thanksgiving. And it is so good. And we sort of like edited it throughout the years to change it a little bit and tweak it to make it so that it's just wonderful, but it's still so nostalgic for me and so delicious. And so then that got me thinking about maybe other autumn sort of bounty vegetarian trio. And so I was thinking maybe for the bottom layer, it could be more of like a butternut squash and maybe like kale or tempeh or walnuts or something to give it a little bit of texture. And then having that mushroom pie feature as the main central layer, and then doing the top similar to Nancy, how she had a galette on top, doing sort of a root vegetable galette that could then showcase really the bright, beautiful rainbow of colors of autumn root vegetables. And so that was my idea. Maybe I'll realize these one by one at some point in my life, because now I'm just excited about those flavor combinations. But I could eat that mushroom pie forever. Whenever I tell people about that, they get weirded out. But I think it comes from an American perspective of not really understanding that pies can be savory and also delicious.
It's fascinating that you made an autumn trio of pies.
I know I kind of copied Richard.
No. That's exactly my selections
Really?
of pies. So I went with the, like, if we're Americans baking, we might as well make them a proper American. So I'm with like, what if we did like Thanksgiving in 3 different pies? I loved the idea that some of the other bakers had, which was like different courses. So like Richard did a meat and a fish and then a dessert. And so I thought of like, what would be a similar thing like that? Like an appetizer and a meal and like a dessert or a pudding. And so of course, apple pie is in there. Try to jazz up Mom's American apple pie, make it look just pretty and beautiful. I made a chicken pot pie this week, and I now need to make it over and over and over again because I think it tasted amazing. I'll definitely use some of your tips when making my pie crust next time because it didn't turn out great, but it was very good. So maybe a turkey pot pie, or add some cranberry. Ooh. Or like, I don't know, maybe if I'm not making it for myself, walnuts and those kinds of other flavors you'd get in like a Thanksgiving dinner. And then I was trying to think of like what would be like an appetizer you could put with like a Thanksgiving. And for some reason, the only thing I could think of was like an asparagus and bacon quiche. Ooh. If that counts as a pie. I don't know.
Ooh, that sounds fun. Well, my family always did like a baked brie that was like covered in walnuts and parsley and then like a cranberry chutney, but I don't know how you would incorporate that into a pie.
You could just cover it in flaky pastry and be like, that's a pie.
Here it is.
Make it a galette, which is like close enough. But I like that we both went for autumn flavors because that's the most American thing I think we've said this entire
so true.
podcast.
And something about fall, it's like it becomes pie season. I think it's just because apple pies, pumpkin pies, like every pecan pies, all that I feel like is very much associated with autumn for me.
I have a new appreciation for pies. Maybe I'll make some more pies.
Yay. This is everything I could have hoped for you.
That brings us to the end of our episode.
Yeah, and thank goodness, finally, what we've all been waiting for. Kate finally earned Star Baker, which is something I know that we've both talked a lot about. Like every episode, I think for the past couple of episodes, we've been like, and Kate deserved Star Baker this week. So I was really excited to see her finally get the title.
Kate did some amazing bakes this week, and I'm glad she finally got there. She's one of my faves, so gotta say I love her. However, this week we had to say goodbye to 2 people, not because 2 people cooked out, but because of some strange issues. This week we're giving a hats off to Diana Beard, who couldn't make it to this episode due to medical reasons, and a hats off to Norman Calder, who was kicked off at the end of the week. So starting off with Diana, we talked about her a little bit last week when we talked about Bingate. Obviously, Ian forgives her. He does not blame her for anything. She even went to his wedding later on.
Amazing.
So there's no problem there. I'm not going to even really talk about it. However, the reason she couldn't be in this week, people had a flurry of issues where they thought, oh, it's because of Bingate and she was too ashamed of what she did. It was not. The reason she couldn't come back that they didn't really explain super well, she was at a group dinner with the rest of the contestants, fell and hurt herself, and her injuries left her without a sense of taste or smell.
Oh my goodness.
So they thought it better that she, be treated by her doctors and she would stay away from the rest of the competition. she just kind of like thanks her for all the things she has left in her life. She still digs into desserts and whatnot, but it was really unfortunate of what happened. And so we were really sad to see Diana go because she was doing some amazing stuff. She also had an amazing life. She's been in the Women's Institutes since she was 13 years old. She baked her daughter's wedding cake and says it's her proudest baking moment.
Oh my goodness. She has such good energy. Like, I remember her first or second episode, like, dancing in front of the oven. Like, I loved that.
She's perfect. Though also you'll like this. I found this in an article. While she was filling out the form to apply for Bake Off, she got a question that was, what's your greatest achievement in the last 10 years? And she was like, I know this is obviously about baking, but instead wrote, being with the same bloke for 40 years.
Oh.
Which is so cute. And so she learned to bake when she was very, very young, sat upon her mother's knee, canning fruits and making butter. And I think that's kind of the whole key to this, is that we're amateur bakers and so are they. And they learned to bake with their mom and their dad. And I think it was adorable to hear about that. One last thing about Diana Beard. She was asked, who do you think is more scary, Paul or Mary?
Ooh.
Her response, neither. They're both pussycats.
Oh, I love that. That's so her energy. Yes.
Good job, Diana. I don't know if she's online anymore. She doesn't really have a social media presence, but we love you, Diana. Hats off to Diana Beard.
Hats off.
Lastly, we're giving a hats off to Norman Calder. He's at Norm Calder on Twitter, and he's from Scotland. He was in the Merchant Navy. His father and his brothers were both bakers, so that's where he learned to bake. But instead of going to the baking field, he went to the Merchant Navy. He said his proudest moment was when he fell overboard, swam 3 miles ashore, and then got picked up by an inter-island boat near Papua New Guinea, which I'm so confused why that's his proudest moment in the Merchant Navy, but
Swimming.
Okay, Norman.
That's a long way to swim.
But his proudest moment was when he fell off a boat.
Yeah, that's fair.
Anyway, he is still badass in all the ways. He grows his own yeast starters. He brews his own wine and his own beer. He does pottery still in his back shed with the kiln that he installed himself. If you go on his Twitter account, he has a link to some photos of the things he's made in that kiln, and they're really pretty.
He made his stand for the 3-tiered pies, I'm pretty sure, because he made the Pieful Tower.
The Pieful Tower. He made the Swiss roll on a skateboard.
Oh, yeah.
He did a lot of cool little cute things. So he's still a really talented person, and he's done some amazing things.
And that brings us to the end of our episode today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sure you will get a cake out of next episode. It's Continental Cake Week. If you've enjoyed what you heard today, please tell your friends and family to check us out. We are on pretty much all of your favorite podcasting apps, and every subscription and download helps us out tons.
We would love it if you would tweet about us or share how much you liked our show. You can find us on Twitter and on Instagram at HotBowPod, as well as on Facebook at facebook.com/HotBowPod. That's HOTBOPOD. You can find links to all of our social media accounts, and you can sign up to be notified whenever we release an episode on our website, hotbowpod.com. That's HOTBOPOD.com. Or, fun fact, hatsofftobakeoff.com also works.
The link to the recipe that I used for my grapefruit tart is on our website. You can get there by navigating to episodes and then find the post for this episode and try it out for yourself. I loved it, and I think you will too. If you do make it, let us know how it went and tag us, HotBowPod, to show it off.
And we will definitely mention you if you do make any dessert. If you want to make any tart or any pie or any of the desserts we've talked about so far, we would love to shout you out. I'd love to give a hats off to Peter Lalish, who wrote our intro and outro music. You can find Peter on Fiverr as PW Lalish, as well as on Bandcamp under the name AKLF. As Norman says, I ken you're awfully smelly, but soon you'll be down my belly. On your marks.
Get set.
Bake.
That is so hard to do together. Also, the second you said haggis, I got so excited. I was like, you're going to love the quote I put in because it's Norman talking about haggis.